Dogman meets Raystown Ray. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've watched your channel for a few years now because I like cryptid stories. Just last month, my fiancée we can call Susie and I both simultaneously had our first cryptid sighting, and amazingly, we saw 2 cryptids at one time. Back in May, Susie got a week off from her job, and I had free time as well, so we decided to get out into nature and camp for a week. Our friends were all interested in socializing since they hadn't done much of that for a year, but Susie and I ached to spend some nights out under the stars after being locked in our apartment for so long. Even though she didn't believe in any cryptids, and she regarded me as childish for making this request, Suze agreed to camp out with me near Raystown Lake so that I could spend some time monster watching. Raystown Lake is located, as you would expect it to be, in one of those many north-south valleys in Pennsylvania, midway between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Those ridges and valleys are peak spots for weird experiences. It seems almost any place you go over there, you've got a decent chance to see not only Dogman and Bigfoot, but also UFOs, ghost lights, and even giant birds or pterodactyls. And the reason I chose Raystown Lake to go to is that it's known to have its own lake monster. I looked it up, and the story is that there's a huge sea serpent like the Loch Ness monster living in the lake, and it comes out usually in April. It's rumored to be a vegan, so it won't eat tourists. There are a number of photos that purport to show Raystown Ray, as the creature's been dubbed. Granted, we were going in May, which is a little late in the Raystown Ray spotting season, but I felt lucky, and I wanted to see the first cryptid of my life. Susie had never heard of Raystown Ray, so she did her own research. Darned if she didn't locate a video on the Logan Gardner channel on YouTube, in which a man named Dwight Beal, the former operations manager of Lake Raystown, tells what he calls the truth behind the Raystown Lake monster. In this video, which you can watch for yourself, Mr. Beal says that years back, he was approached by someone from a local newspaper that wanted to do an April Fool's lake monster story. They asked Mr. Beal, in his capacity as operations manager of the lake, to play along and pretend to believe that there's a monster in the lake. He decided to go along with the gag and even convinced his staff biologist to risk his reputation and to state for the record that there is in fact a big sea serpent in Raystown Lake, and that it doesn't eat meat. This way families wouldn't be afraid to vacation on the lake, and hopefully it would attract curious people in the way it had attracted me. Now Raystown Ray has his own website with a merch store selling t-shirts and postcards. Susie laughed and said to me, "Dude, it's all just a tourist trap." That last comment was one I took offense to. I asked her how she didn't know that the video wasn't the real April Fool's prank. Maybe Mr. Beal was just joking when he said that the monster doesn't exist. Where did all the photos of it come from, if it isn't real? I asked Susie. I don't know, she answered. Maybe the graphics department of the tourism board? She kind of hurt my feelings, so I pouted. She found that incredibly funny for some reason, and told me that she wanted to go to Raystown Lake to camp, which I know she didn't really want to do. So the monster hunt was back on. One of the coolest things I noticed from looking at a map of the place is that the lake itself looks like a sea serpent from above. It twists and turns like a giant water snake slithering its way up the narrow valley in Pennsylvania. Of course there's a lake monster there. How could there not be? We considered staying at the Susquehanna campground, but once we arrived there, it seemed too civilized for me. I talked Susie into joining me scouting around for another more private place to stay, and if we couldn't find a better place to set up camp, I'd agree to go back to the official campsite. Well, it wasn't even an hour later that we found a perfect spot on a little triangular-shaped beach jutting out into the lake. We had trees surrounding us on 3 sides, and the lake out in front. It was the perfect spot. It was fantastic. We had the sunny beach. We had the shade of the trees 10 feet behind us. We had the water in front of us, and I had a great view for monster watching. Our first day there proved eventful, as 2 really tall, red-bearded bald men showed up and claimed that we were camping on their property. They were pretty intimidating, and we said we'd pull up our camp and go stay at the Susquehanna campground instead. The men asked us how long we were planning on being there, and we said 5 or 6 more days. They talked between themselves, then asked if we would be willing to pay $75 for the week. We offered to PayPal the money, but they said cash only. I think we had around $67 combined on us, which they took and departed, saying, "Have a fun week." An hour or 2 later, a couple in their 30s or 40s approached with 2 tween-age kids, asking if we knew that we were on private land. We said, well, yes, we did, but we already paid the owners to rent it for the week, and so everything was cool. "You paid the owners, did you?" asked the man. "I don't see how that's possible since my wife here and I are the owners." Their kids glared at us like we were criminals. "We paid these 2 big, bald, red-bearded guys," Susie insisted. The couple looked at each other knowingly. "You know who we mean, don't you?" asked Susie. In fact, they did, and they said it wasn't the first time those guys had pulled that scam. They decided to let us stay for free, but gave us their number and asked us to give them a ring if we saw those red-beard guys again. We agreed, and they left, but we never saw them or the 2 bald men again. Somehow, Susie was annoyed at me over all of this. It was the second night when things really got crazy. I had lost my phone in the lake earlier in the day, which was incredibly stupid of me. Susie had bought that phone for me and was unhappy with me for swimming out into the lake with it. I had read online that it was waterproof or something, and I wanted to test it. But a strong wave hit me, and I let loose of the camera. As soon as it slipped out of my hand, I lost sight of it, as the sun was beating down brightly on the surface of the lake. I tried to stick my head underwater to look for it, but managed to inhale water instead, and came up coughing and wheezing for most of the rest of the afternoon. I was feeling stupid, and Susie was getting cranky. First she had to give up all her cash, then I lost the phone she had bought for me. She was clearly having second thoughts about both this vacation and our engagement. It was not a happy moment in our lives. Susie went to sleep early in the tent, and I sat silently in the darkness on the beach. It was a beautiful night, but I couldn't enjoy it. I decided to start making plans in my head for what I would do if Susie dumped me once this vacation was over. A lot of times when I plan for the worst case scenario, I find it takes some of the stress out of my life. So, I was not just feeling small inside, I was projecting smallness out to the world. I was silent. I was unimportant. I was invisible. I saw a rodent of some kind walk right past me, only about a foot away, just as though it knew I posed no threat to it whatsoever. If you've ever heard of someone wishing they could be a fly on the wall, well, I was even less noticeable than that. Cats will chase a fly on the wall, but even cats would have been bored with me that night. That was why I think I got to see the incredible things that happened next. Strolling into my view past the patch of trees to my left came a dripping wet, 6 or 7 foot tall, hairy, upright, canine-type humanoid. It had dog-like hind legs, but the torso and upper body of an extremely muscular man. It had a dog-type head with a long snout and a dog nose. Its pointed ears were on top of its head. Although I had not seen it walk out of the water, that's what it must have done on the other side of those trees, since it was soaking wet all over. The beast man was carrying 2 large fish with it, which it dropped to the sand, where they bounced and wriggled around. The Dogman turned in my direction, and I scrunched myself down reflexively. It proceeded to shake itself around to dry off, staring past me and above me as it did so. I was pretty sure it hadn't noticed me, or else it didn't care. I wasn't sure if it saw our tent over by the trees, as that might have been hidden from its view also behind some foliage. I had always wanted to see something like what I was seeing, but I had always imagined being at a much safer distance than I was. If that Dogman noticed me, it could be on top of me before I would even be able to stand up to run away. On top of that, I had been sitting in an uncomfortable position while I was moping and feeling sorry for myself, so one of my legs was kind of asleep. I stretched it out slowly and massaged it gently, trying to reboot my circulatory system since I now had a much larger problem than I had a little while earlier. I wished I had my phone with me, but then again, I still wish that even as I'm writing this, I may have saved up enough to afford a new one by the time you're reading this, but then again I may not have. I wished I could be snapping pics or taking video. That way, if the Dogman ended my life, at least I might leave behind some evidence of how it happened. I turned and looked for the tent. From my vantage point, it looked like it was 7 miles away. The idea of getting up and trying to move back there before the Dogman caught up to me would be ridiculous. I wouldn't stand a chance. Calling out to Susie to take a pic with her phone wouldn't work either. It would attract too much attention. About the only thing I could try would be to psychically signal to her, but she was so unhappy with me that I doubted she would be tuned in to my wavelength. From the beach came a loud splashing, as though the Titanic had just bubbled up to the surface of the water. I spun around and saw the exact thing that I had come there to see. A sea serpent in Raystown Lake. A dinosaur or lizard-like head, even larger than the Dogman's head, had lifted dramatically up out of the water at the end of an incredibly long reptile or snake-like head. I don't really know if the entire thing was one long giant water snake or eel, or if it eventually attached to some sort of plesiosaur-like body under the waves, but that neck alone was longer than the Dogman was tall. So if the Dogman was 6 or 7 feet, that neck would have had to have been 10, 11, 12 feet, possibly even longer, since I could not see under the water in the dark night. The lake monster at first went straight for the fish on the beach, trying to grab them in its immense monster jaws. That thing looked like its mouth was large enough to bite off half your body in one snap. The teeth were even longer than the Dogman's, and they looked like little saw-edged knives all in a row. I bet it had several replacements ready for each tooth, just like a shark does, as its teeth looked more like those of a shark than any other sea animal I've ever become aware of. Just before the big lake lizard could grab the fish, though, the Dogman did a kind of a sideways block, slamming into that head in much the same way an American football player might stop the forward movement of a player on the opposing team. The Dogman reacted to the serpent's head as one would react to an entire human being. The head was just so insanely large. I sat there, mesmerized, as the Dogman snapped at the monster head, which withdrew to a height just out of the Dogman's reach. The canine man leaped forward, grabbing onto the sea snake's scaly neck with one claw, and using his momentum to get close enough to try to slash open the sea-bound creature's throat. That was when I saw how nimble every single part of that sea snake was, as it could pull that part of its neck out of the way without pulling its entire body backward. This seemed like an impossible movement as I saw it in real time. All I can assume is that the body of the creature must have been holding onto something in a sturdy fashion somehow. It was anchored, in other words, but I could not see how from my angle. While the Dogman was trying and failing to slice open the lizard creature's exposed throat, the demon fish snapped at the Dogman's back. There came a moment when both creatures appeared to have hurt the other one. I heard the Dogman scream the way a dog might if it stepped into a bear trap, and that water creature sounded like a deep-voiced flipper on steroids. I don't know how else to describe it. I guess it sort of sounded like an elephant trumpeting, but with a much deeper tone to it. I was wondering if both creatures were about to finish each other off. With all the noise they were generating, and with their focus being squarely and exclusively on each other, it dawned on me that this would be a good time to run back to the tent and wake up little Susie. I stood up on those unsteady legs, one of which was still half asleep. I began rubbing it and taking a step or two forward as I could manage. A terrible racket erupted behind me on the beach, and I instinctively dropped back down to the sand in a defensive position. I know you're probably thinking that I'm an idiot for not continuing to run back to the tent, but you don't realize how intimidating it was to be that close to not one, but two large cryptids that could easily snuff out my life without even thinking twice about it. In the case of the lake monster, I'm not sure fish even think at all. If you're wondering how the landlocked Dogman was able to hold his own against the much larger sea creature, you have to understand that his claws that extended from his hand-like paws were so long that it was just sick. It was like a row of giant, super-sharp fish hooks at the end of super-long, ape-like arms. And the dog was fighting over its food, so it was not messing around. It was a kill-or-be-killed situation, and that Dogman had no intention of losing the battle. I imagine that the sea creature had been competing for the same fish that the Dogman caught, but I also wondered if the Dogman might have stolen them from the lake monster somehow. One way or another, that water monster had to have seen the Dogman exiting the lake with the big fish in his possession. It was not a random attack. I think Raystown Ray had spied on and pursued the Dogman. Otherwise, how would he have known to lift up out of the water exactly where it had crashed up to the surface? Obviously, I can't be certain since all that had to have happened before I looked over there, but it kind of makes the most sense to me as to what must have happened, in the prequel, as it were. The battle was continuing and neither creature had noticed me so far, so I resumed my disjointed movement away from the beach and back toward the tent. When I got there, I was stunned to find that Susie had zipped herself inside the tent with me still outside. I whispered her name, but she did not respond. I reached under the tent to grab the zipper from the inside and began to work the zipper up. It wasn't going very well. A big splash came from the lake, and I looked over to see the great water beast flailing about, with the Dogman off the ground, hanging onto its throat. The Dogman was splashed into the lake, then onto the beach. It never loosened its grip on the lake monster's neck. Its claws must have been as strong as if they were made of steel to withstand the beating that the snake-like head and neck was giving them. I heard the sound of unzipping and was relieved to see the cranky face of my girlfriend glaring out at me. "What do you want?" that face asked me. "Your phone," I whispered. "No way," came her loud reply. "Not after what you did to your own." "Shh." I hushed her. "Come look," I whispered, gesturing that she should come outside. She looked at me the way that white dog looks at the Victrola in the old RCA ads from the 20th century, and so I pointed toward the beach emphatically with my eyes wide open. I was trying to get her to understand that this was more important than me losing my phone. Curiously, she leaned her head out of the tent and looked toward the beach. "What the blank?" she asked, having trouble taking in the complexity of what her eyes were seeing. Yes, there was a lake monster, but also, yes, there was a Dogman, and, yes, they were having a life-and-death battle. The sea snake succeeded in hurling the Dogman off its neck, and the large bipedal canine landed hard on the sand back down and belly up. I could hear the wheeze of the wind being knocked out of the beast, and in that instant, the lake monster swallowed up both fish plus a whole lot of sand and slipped back into the water. "Your phone," I said more loudly. "Take a goddamn picture." Susie finally understood and withdrew into the tent to grab her cell phone. I looked toward the beach, and the Dogman, still trying to refill its lungs with air, was beginning to climb to his dog-like feet. Susie emerged from the tent, fiddling with her phone. "Ugh," she said. "Wait, it didn't open the app right. I have to turn it off and turn it back on again." As she said this, I watched the Dogman running down the beach to our right, chasing the lake monster, I would presume. Maybe it could see where the lake monster was swimming, something I could not see from my angle. "Here, give me the phone," I said, grabbing it from her hands and running down toward the beach. The phone was still rebooting itself. I was pretty sure she only needed to restart the app, not the whole phone, but there was nothing I could do about that. I ran down to the beach, still able to see the Dogman off in the distance. As the phone opened up again, I tapped the camera app, which eventually came on. The Dogman leaped into the water, swimming after the lake monster and those fishes it had stolen. It seemed to me that it would be a whole lot easier just to catch a new fish than to fight Raystown Ray again, but I think by that point it had become sort of a grudge match. I held the camera up and zoomed in as far as it could go, but there was nothing to see anymore by that point. I stayed there, standing, waiting, hoping that either of the creatures might double back and give me another chance at a photo, but it was not meant to be. When I got back to the tent, Susie was outside waiting for me. I figured I was about to get lectured for stealing her phone, but she was just happy that I hadn't lost or broken it. She was also apologetic for reacting too slowly when the monsters were battling right in front of us. That surprised me. She actually apologized, something that I wasn't aware that girlfriends ever did. She even gave me a little speech about how she knew how much it meant to me to get to see a cryptid, and how she felt kind of guilty that her bad mood ruined my chance to get a cryptid photo. "I should have been out there on the beach with you," she said, "not in the tent punishing you because you accidentally lost your cell phone and so forth." Somehow this weird situation had made her all romantic. I was not in the mood at all for that, but it was a lot better than getting lectured, so I tried my best to reciprocate and not let her notice that I was still shaking all over from the shock of everything that had just gone down. One of the nice things that came out of this is that Susie is now a lot more interested in what I'm interested in. She's more open to a lot of the stuff I care about, like Dogman and Bigfoot and aliens and all of that. I like her a lot more too. She seems so much cooler than she ever seemed before. The last time we visited her parents, she even wore her Raystown Ray Lake Monster t-shirt that she got from the Raystown Ray website. I feel like our relationship got a second chance thanks to the Dogman. But Susie and I do have one correction to add to the Raystown Ray mythology. If that monster was a vegan, then it never would have been fighting Dogman over those two big fish on the beach. No, Raystown Ray is clearly on a seafood diet. That's something my fiancé and I learned without a doubt on the night when we saw Dogman meets Raystown Ray. Shout hooray and ring the bells, our new EP is Lisa Wells. Now we have a tale to tell, because that Lisa's really swell. Please join us in thanking our newest PayPal subscriber, Lisa Wells, for making this episode possible. In exchange, she gets to see our secret uncensored stories, as well as our over 15 hours of archived scary Dogman stories far too wild to tell on this channel. Now here's PQ River as Dr. Death to explain all the details. Doctor?
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.